Today's episode is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform for building your brand and growing your business. More about them in a bit. The name Devil's Islands conjures up images of almost unspeakable brutality, yet the island prison was but a small part of the prison colony of French Guiana. France originally claimed the area in the 17th century and found it nearly impossible to colonize. In 1763 alone, 12,000 settlers arrived in the region. By the end of that year, only 2,000 were alive, the rest having succumbed to the harsh climate and the tropical diseases they encountered. The survivors took refuge on 3 small islands off the coast of the mainland, called by the French the Salvation Islands. Of these, 3 were habitable: Ile Royale, Ile St. Joseph, and Ile du Diable, or the Devil's Islands. As early as 1795, the French Directory, which controlled the government of revolutionary France, exiled undesirables to French Guiana, though they were not imprisoned. Their crimes consisted only of being a perceived danger to the new order in France, and many of the exiles were priests. They suffered the same risk of disease and death, with the high rate of the latter preventing the colony from flourishing. In the mid-19th century, Napoleon III, desirous of ridding France of criminals both petty and felonious, as well as political enemies and other undesirables, established French Guiana as a penal colony for men. Prisoners were expected to build their own prison, a railroad into the jungle, and to harvest lumber on the mainland. The islands, surrounded by shark-infested waters, were to house those who refused to work or were considered to be too dangerous to mingle with the prison population. In 1852, the first transport of convicts to the colony began. Those arriving there did not see Dante's famous dictum to abandon all hope, though they may as well have. The laws were written so that few of the arriving prisoners had any hope of ever seeing France again should they happen to survive the terms of their sentences. And very few did. Over the course of the ensuing century, approximately 70,000 prisoners arrived at the colony. About 5,000 of them survived their sentences, and less than 2,000 were allowed to leave the prison colony once their terms were completed. Napoleon III was so enamored with his scheme to free mainland France from the criminal elements that he ensured even relatively petty crimes could result in deportation. Stealing a loaf of bread could lead to incarceration alongside a murderer, especially if the thief was a repeat offender. Although France had the guillotine for capital crimes, judges were encouraged to sentence prisoners to deportation rather than execution by beheading. Prisoner labor was to replace the abolished slave labor. To avoid the appearance of slavery, a stipend for each prisoner was paid, though it was usually confiscated by guards. Prisoners were also allowed to receive money from families and friends. French law decreed that prisoners deported to serve sentences of 8 years or longer could never return to France, in effect forcing the prisoner to remain in the colony after his sentence was served. Prisoners sentenced to less than 8 years came under the rule of doublage. The sentence of less than 8 years, for example 3, meant 3 additional years in the colony under doublage. 4 years meant 4, and so on. Prisoners serving the doublage sentence had certain privileges, including the ability to earn money outside the prison system, though they were still counted as part of the prison colony's population. Whether the new arrivals were hardened criminals or relatively minor miscreants made no difference to their guards. Harsh treatment began while the prisoners were still in France awaiting transport. Beatings with fists, rifle butts, and whips were all inflicted by the guards, with little interruption from their officers. Until the prisoners were loaded aboard ships for deportation, they were held under guard by the French army, usually French colonial troops from Senegal. In France, the prisoners were collected from the courts and jails and held in a military prison near the port of La Rochelle on the Bay of Biscay. Hello, fellow internet enthusiasts. Do you want to build a beautiful website that stands out and grows your business online? Well, look no further than Squarespace, the all-in-one platform that has everything you need. Whether you're a blogger, an entrepreneur, or an artist, Squarespace has customizable templates and design tools that allow you to create a professional-looking website without needing to know how to code. And let's not forget about the e-commerce functionality that enables you to set up and manage online stores with ease. You can even collect donations for your favorite cause. You also will have access to in-depth website analytics tools that give you powerful insights into who's visiting your site and how they're interacting with your content. Plus, Squarespace has powerful blogging tools to let you share your stories, photos, videos, and updates. You categorize, share, and schedule your posts to make sure that your content is working for you. Plus, you could do email campaigns, customize every email you send with your brands and colors and logos. It's very easy to do. And you've got analytics to make sure that you know what's happening with each of those emails, who's opening it, who's reading it, etc. So what are you waiting for? Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain, and use the code geographics at checkout. And now back to today's video. Prisoners were packed into a steamer, wearing the only clothes they were allowed, as well as wooden clogs for shoes. Few hammocks were available, so the only comfort for sleeping was found on the deck, if sufficient space to lie down could even be found. In the mid-19th century, the voyage from La Rochelle to French Guiana took about 3 weeks. One of the more famous prisoners from the colony, Henri Charrier, known to history as Papillon, butterfly, described his transport as consisting of 1,800 men about to vanish from ordinary life forever. The prisoners, for the most part, had no idea what awaited them at their destination. Simply surviving long enough to reach it was their chief occupation on the voyage. Murders among the prisoners were frequent. Their guards usually looked the other way, rather than note problems between prisoners. Inmates found in possession of anything which hadn't been issued them endured beatings, after which they were chained in the bilges for the remainder of their journey. The heat from the ship's steam engines added to their misery, as did the incessant roar of the machinery. The 3-week or so journey ended at a new prison erected to the standards of the French authorities at Saint-Laurent on the Maroni River of the mainland of French Guiana. There, the disembarked inmates were assigned classifications within the penal colony. Those who had spent most of their journey in shackles or possessed records of past misbehavior towards their guards found themselves classified as incos, short for incorrigibles. Their immediate reward was being dispatched into the jungle to work camps established to house laborers who were harvesting timber and building a railroad. The remaining inmates were classified as releg, or petty offenders, or transportes, serious offenders. All 3 classifications yearned for the designation of libérés, prisoners who had completed court-imposed sentences, but due to doublage and other laws were not yet free to leave the colony. One of the first things learned by the arriving inmates was the near impossibility of escape. Alongside French Guiana were Dutch and British colonies. The Dutch happily returned escaping inmates to the French authorities. The British did not welcome prisoners either, though they gave them some time to arrange passage from British Guiana before handing them back to the French. Escape attempts, as well as other indiscretions, demanded punishment. Beatings, withdrawal of what little food there was, and other punishments were supplemented by solitary confinement on the island prisons of Ile-Saint-Joseph and Île-Royale. Escape from the mainland prisons was considered virtually impossible and required outside assistance in the view of the authorities. The Maroni River, as well as its tributaries, was populated with Caiman, a member of the alligator family, as well as crocodiles, piranhas, and several species of dangerous snakes. Men were watched closely at the work camps, where they had daily quotas of labor to complete. Guards determined which of the men completed their daily quotas. They also guarded against escape attempts, and though they happily accepted bribes from prisoners, they did not always deliver what the bribe was intended to pay for. For those who rebelled against the forced labor, inadequate and often inedible food, cruelty of the guards, the centipedes and other biting pests, leeches, bats, and the steamy air, there was the punishment of the prisons within the prison. If it was difficult escaping from the work camps on the mainland, from the islands, it was well nigh impossible. The islands rose from the sea from rocky shorelines, and the waters which surrounded them beat against them with a heavy surf. In addition, the waters were shark-infested. Half-starved, exhausted men drained of physical strength had little chance of surviving a swim from the islands. Yet men continued to escape, despite standing orders for their guards to shoot to kill. 2 years of solitary confinement was the punishment for the first attempt, added on to their existing sentence. For a second attempt, 5 years were added on. Henri Charrier received a 2-year stint in solitary for his first escape attempt, served in the prison within a prison of Ile-Saint-Joseph. There he was required to maintain a monastic silence, speaking only when addressed by a guard or warden. A violation of the rule added another 30 days to confinement in a dank cell he shared with cockroaches, rats, centipedes, and other unwelcome guests. Libérés were the classification of prisoners who had completed their prison sentence but were not at liberty to return to France. Since they were no longer prisoners forced to work, their stipend ended. There were few means of generating income. One such means was accepting bribes from would-be escapers to assist them, either as a guide through the jungle or by obtaining a boat. Often libérés turned against the escapers, robbing them and killing them in the jungle. Others worked with the guards, helping to track down those men who fled into the jungle in return for a financial reward. Libérés working with the French administration received a dead or alive warrant. Killing and robbing an escapee, afterwards delivering the dead body to the authorities, was a lucrative undertaking for some. Escapees that survived the jungle, the guards, and the libérés often found themselves recaptured, classified as incos, and sent to Île-Royale, where they occupied a former barracks that became known as the Crimson Barracks. During working hours, prisoners there were forced to remain standing or pacing in their cells. Gratings in the roof above their cells allowed the guards to ensure that they did just that. If a guard, a Libere or another prisoner died as a result of an escape attempt, the recaptured prisoner faced the guillotine. While many did die on the beheading machine, many others did not, since the income of the governors of the prison colony was dependent on the number of prisoners under their care. Executing a prisoner removed a portion of that income, and leaving them to rot for years of solitary confinement on Ile Royale was usually deemed sufficient punishment. When the guillotine was used, it was the responsibility of the prisoners to designate some among them to serve as executioner, absolving the guards from judicial murder. The least populated of the prisons that comprised French Guiana was Ile de Diable. Over the near century that the prison complex was in operation, only about 50 prisoners were housed there. It was the housing complex for what the French government considered the most dangerous prisoners of all, those considered enemies of France for their political views. Only political prisoners were sent to the Devil's Islands, where they were held in isolation in the former leper colony. Devil's Islands was the smallest of the three prisons, and it was accessed from Ile Royale across a 60-meter wide strait. Passing by boat was dangerous due to the swirling currents and rocky coasts. Eventually, a cable car traversed the passage between the two islands. Conditions for the few inmates on Devil's Islands were relatively benign in comparison to the other prisons which made up the complex, yet it eventually gave its name to the entire prison system. Most of the horrors of the prison system actually took place away from Devil's Island on the mainland. It was there that prisoners were sometimes chained to trees in the jungle and abandoned to await their fate from nature in the form of wild animals, insects, starvation, and dehydration. It was in the other prisons where men were tortured in their cells by guards or their fellow prisoners, tormented by rats and insects, driven to near insanity from starvation and brutal forced labor. The prisoners on Devil's Islands were not packed together in crowded cell blocks nor forced to live under canvas tents at jungle camps. They were alienated in part to ensure their radical ideas concerning politics and government did not infect the prison population. Yet it was the case of one prisoner condemned to Devil's Islands that first revealed the horrors of French Guiana to the world. That prisoner was a French military officer named Alfred Dreyfus, and his case became an international sensation. In France, the socio-political scandal involving Alfred Dreyfus is still simply known as l'affaire, the affair. In 1984, French government and military leaders became concerned over military and diplomatic secrets falling into the hands of the German embassy through what would be known in subsequent years as leaks. A French spy working in the German embassy as a housekeeper uncovered a torn-up note that revealed certain French military developments and mentioned that they would soon be transmitted to a French ally. Once her masters in the French military intelligence service learned of the documents which she obtained for them, they initiated an investigation. Eventually, the French authorities charged an army captain, Alfred Dreyfus, with communicating French military secrets to the Germans. Dreyfus was from the Alsatian region of France, Jewish, and had political views repugnant to the government of the French Third Republic. As an Alsatian, he spoke fluent German, and as a practitioner of the Jewish faith, his religion conflicted with Catholic France. Despite a marked paucity of evidence against him, he was convicted of collusion with a foreign power against the state. The case was tried before a military tribunal closed to the public, but simultaneously also in the court of public opinion in the French press. Among the contributing factors to his conviction was rampant anti-Semitism prevalent in France, including among the officer corps, as well as rising nationalism. Nearly all subsequent scholarship agrees that Dreyfus was entirely innocent of the crimes he was charged with. Nonetheless, he was sentenced to deportation to the French prison colony in Guyana, where he was placed in isolation on Ile Royale. He arrived there in March 1895. After a month, he was transferred to Devil's Island, where he was the only inmate held there at the time and occupied a stone hovel about 1.2 square meters. In the late summer of 1896, Dreyfus was shackled to a bunk in his hut, freed only when his guards came to allow him to attend to calls of nature. The shackling was ordered when French authorities learned of an alleged plot for supporters of Dreyfus to arrange his escape. Though Dreyfus was allowed to write letters to his wife, they were censored by the prison wardens. So were the letters he received. This meant that Dreyfus was kept in the dark about new developments in the spy case that revealed a different culprit. French authorities suppressed the information, convicted the real spy, and continued to hold Dreyfus on Devil's Island. By 1899, support for Dreyfus among various French political and social entities had reached such a level of intensity it became known as Dreyfusism, with his supporters called Dreyfusards. That same year, the conviction that led to Dreyfus's imprisonment was overturned. Dreyfus was removed from Devil's Island and returned to France, where he continued to be held in confinement, though no longer legally guilty of any crime. He was tried again, convicted again, and though sentenced to 10 years, he was not to return to Devil's Island. In a mass act of clemency, all persons involved in l'affaire were pardoned, including those who manufactured or suppressed evidence, committed perjury, committed treason, or otherwise were charged with breaking the law, including Alfred Dreyfus. The mass clemency allowed the depth of the conspiracy to remain effectively hidden for decades, though it gradually emerged over time. What also emerged were the conditions of the penal system, including those in French Guiana. While France dealt with, and has dealt with ever since, the legal, extra-legal, and socio-political fallout of l'affaire, the rest of the Western world reacted with shock and horror at the conditions in the prison colony of French Guiana. Since Dreyfus had been incarcerated on Devil's Island, that name came to signify the entire penal colony. Among the prisoners both in French Guiana and other French colonies, as well as in France, the penal colony became known as La Guillotine Sèche, the dry guillotine. In June 1913, American writer, explorer, and social reformer Charles Wellington Furlong published Caiman, the Dry Guillotine, in the popular Harper's Magazine. His was among the first detailed depictions of the conditions in the French penal colony to be penned by someone from outside the prison system. Furlong overcame the objections of the authorities, prison guards, and even some of the prisoners themselves to document the conditions found in French Guiana. At the time of his visit to the penal colony, according to his account, there were about 7,000 prisoners in custody and an unknown number of liberes living in Guyana. Furlong described several instances of prisoner revolts and attacks on their guards called wardens in his article. In one instance, he described a warden murdered in the jungle by an inmate using a machete. In another, he told of the revolt on Ile Saint-Joseph in 1894 that resulted in the deaths of several guards and inmates. Rival gangs prowled the prisons in Furlong's article, settling disputes among themselves and with other gangs using weapons fabricated from tools meant to work in the jungles and fields. Furlong also reported a death rate of about 1 man per day from disease. Most of the dead prisoners were buried by dumping the body in the Moroni River or into the sea, whichever was closer. Predators then disposed of the remains. Another work describing life in the prison colony of French Guiana appeared in 1928 in book form titled Condemned to Devil's Island. Written by American geographer and writer Blair Niles, the book used material written by an inmate while incarcerated in French Guiana. Niles fictionalized escape attempts by the inmate Renée Belbenois, from whom she purchased the rights while visiting the colony. Her book became the basis for a 1929 film of the same name starring popular actor Ronald Colman, and further strengthening condemnation from the public over conditions in the colony. Henri Charrier became famous upon publication of his autobiographical memoir Papillon in 1969, a book that later spawned 2 films. Papillon describes life on Devil's Island, Charrier's escape, return, and eventual successful escape, though the work's accuracy has been questioned. As noted, Devil's Island was used solely for political prisoners. However, Charrier was convicted and transported for murder. Most scholars believe he placed himself at the center of events that actually occurred to other prisoners. By the time of the book's publication, the French Guiana prison colony had become known universally as Devil's Island, so called in films, documentaries, articles, and books, and Charrier appropriated this name for his book. French scholars dispute Charrier's account of his escape from Devil's Island as recounted in Papillon. He was never incarcerated on the island, nor was there a work camp there, as he asserted. Much of his time in French Guiana saw him work as a nurse in the prison hospital. At the hospital, he frequently treated recaptured prisoners and others, and heard the tales of their adventures, which he co-opted for himself. He was later assigned as a nurse at a work camp from which he eventually escaped, making his way to freedom, and he wrote the book which made him wealthy and a folk hero in France. In the 1930s, public clamor and printed outrage over the prisoners' living conditions led the French government to decide to close the prisons while maintaining the colony as a French possession. The decision had not yet been implemented when the Second World War began, and France's rapid collapse in 1940 led to American intervention in the colony. Concerns over Vichy France's collaboration with Nazi Germany and its effect on American interests in the region forced the Americans to occupy Suriname, that's Dutch Guiana, along its border with the colony. The Americans patrolled the border, and escaped prisoners were turned over to the authorities in Suriname. The final escapes from the prison colony took place in 1953, when, with the assistance of the Salvation Army, the French government repatriated the remaining prisoners to France. The Bears were given the option of remaining in French Guiana if they so desired. Some did, though understandably many did not. The buildings of the prison system were allowed to deteriorate, and the jungle reclaimed the work camps. In 1965, the French National Centre of Space Studies, CNES, assumed control of the islands which once housed prisoners. They founded the Guiana Space Centre, and the rockets launched from Guiana are monitored by facilities on the islands. CNES also restored some of the prison facilities throughout the region, including the Stone Hut, where Alfred Dreyfus spent his confinement on Devil's Island. Since then, the islands have become a popular tourist destination, though Ile de Diable is no longer accessible to visitors.